Hi, this is Mark Arnold with yet another Fun Ideas podcast. And today I have two special guests. They've both been on before, but this time it's to promote some new books and some toys. I got voice artist and announcer and book author Keith Scott.
Hey,
And
Mark, how are you?
oh, good. How are you?
I'm just fine,
And
all the
he's
way from down under.
yeah,
The
he's
magic, the magic of
I'm
Zoom.
in Oregon, and you're in where are you in Australia?
In Sydney on the
Sydney.
east
Okay,
coast, facing your west coast.
got it. Hi.
And you're in Alabama, right, Camden?
Yep.
And
Boy,
then
this is all over the map.
And then we have animation historian and collector of fine toys, Kamden Spies. Wait, do that again. Play it again.
Yeah.
Whoa, Beanie Boy.
Yes, this guy talks. He still talks. I beat Tim Hollis because his doesn't talk.
I've had an opportunity to buy one of those before. I just never done it. And I don't remember if the one I've seen, because I know it's still there, and I think it's because it's a bit pricey.
Now this guy
I think it
talks too, and this guy I got for a steal for about $2 at a flea market.
Oh, it does.
Kind of dork.
Let's see. I have a talking Bugs Bunny, not with me, and I have a talking Yogi Bear. Are these all
This one was not cheap.
Are these all recent purchases?
These are purchases within the past week.
And is that like a modern reproduction, or is it a vintage piece that you've got there?
Yeah, no, this is the real lunchbox.
Yeah, it looks original. So that's from like
nice.
1960, 61.
Yeah, this was the one that was not cheap.
Yeah. Yes, I can imagine. Would that have a date on it somewhere, like copyright 1961?
61, something like that. Yeah.
Great. Very nice.
I just love that even the sides of it are great.
Yeah.
Is there a thermos or is it just the box?
Yes, I actually had the thermos before.
Ooh.
I had the thermos before this.
Oh, cool. Nifty.
Thermos missing cap.
Yeah, I never was someone who got all the merch in whenever I visited America, because it would simply make my luggage count home so weighty.
So much too.
Yeah, there's yeah.
My parents can attest to that. whenever I'm traveling, I'm in antique stores buying stuff.
Right. I like the thing behind you there, behind the at the back of the wall there, that contains all the books. You showed, I think, on Facebook.
That is a journey and a story that I think I've told on this podcast before, Mark.
That's fine.
Right.
Yeah, getting that.
Didn't you get in another state or something?
Getting that rack there involved a sitting in the back of a Greyhound bus by itself from Sioux Falls, South Dakota to Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Amazing. That didn't get stolen.
Poor collector got off the bus and forgot it.
Yeah.
It was like, apparently it was like my grandfather rode with it. It was like sitting in the back of the bus, like not the back of the bus, but the trunk of the bus box, and it's still nothing, no harm to it whatsoever.
Wow.
Leaning up.
It was wrapped in pillows and everything, I guess. Which I'm like, okay. I just got lucky for who drove the bus.
It was meant to be.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and now it's in Birmingham, so it's traveled a bit.
Well,
oh yeah.
That rat could talk.
Yes.
Let's see. So, I guess with Keith, let's start off with the purpose of you being here, besides being a great pal, friend, and everything. So you have not one, but two brand new books. How did this manage to become? Was this always designed to be two?
No, it wasn't. But once they did the typesetting, Ben suddenly emailed me, the publisher Ben Omart for your listeners, with a panic. It was something I think that only people in his line of work in the publishing field get the technicalities of it, but it was either the printer or the distributor who said, you know what, this book's going to be quite thick and it would be easier to put it out in two. And fortunately, the minute he said that, it just popped into my head, well, why don't we just cut the filmographies off the end of the book and make that the reference book? And apparently that he said he could still have done it as a single volume, but there would have been some sort of problem that I do not understand.
Yeah. Well, let's see, how many pages is this? So the larger one is a little over 500.
Right.
And the smaller one is a little over 300. Well, yeah, I know from talking with Ben before, because I did a 2-volume cracked set, that after you get much over 500 pages, it's really hard to manage and maintain the spine, because and the hardbacks probably are more durable, which is probably one reason why I got them. But
I'm getting so old, it's hard to maintain my spine.
As a librarianship master soon to be, master's degree soon to be, the book spines, I work at a public library. It drives them all nuts because I'm always bringing broken books. They're like, "Why do you keep bringing these?" And they're like, if you don't want the pages of the Harry Potter books sprinkled all over the floor, then you're gonna let me bring them to you.
Yeah. So
it was a wide Alan Rickman saying, "Turn that into 2 books immediately, young Potter."
I should just have you answer every question in a different voice. So it was actually a wise choice, and the odd part is, and I think I told you this separately, the second volume is my favorite volume.
Well, you're probably that sort of mind like me.
And there's nothing wrong with the first volume. It's just that if I had this and Jerry Beck and Will Friedwald's Looney Tunes book, when that one came out, I'd be like, I'd have all the voices memorized in my head. It's like, this person did this and this, but it's like I never knew half of them. I mean, the obvious ones I knew like Stan Freberg, June Foray, Ben Aderet, but it's like the one, and it may be elsewhere. Kamden will probably say, well, it's been on Cartoon Research for 10 years. I don't know. But I never knew the voice of Al Jolson in I Want to Sing It, or what is it called?
Little Al Jolson. Right.
It was Tommy Bond, who was in the Little Rascals Our Gang films. And I go, that's, of course it is. But how would I know? It just sounded like a kid's voice. It could have been anybody.
And also
I didn't know about Bernice Hanson's name for Hansel,
yeah,
and apparently that had been miscredited for years.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was Rudolph Ising himself and Bob Clampett, who usually had the best memory in the whole business, who I think just mistakenly called it Hanson, and that's how it was passed down from Jerry's first ever Warner Brothers book in '81, and then in the Disney archives, there was an English researcher that I know called Graham Webb, and he saw it was listed as Hansel. And it was in like handwriting, not typewriting. So we thought, maybe it's just the way it looks. But then Tex Avery, there was a transcript of him at one of the ASIFAs where he won an award back in '74. And he actually can be heard saying, of all of the voices that he used, Bernice Hansel with the L. So it was just one of those tiny little things that had to finally be corrected,
Yeah, I remember I found out that first, I think both on your book, and then I was reminded because Yelp did a article about that similar.
That's right. And then Eric Costello did one recently where he found a similar information, but the newspaper finally had a picture of her, and it was like an author's nightmare. It's like it comes out after the book's published. So, and we've all suffered from that. But, just before we go on, you're talking about volume 2. The minute it was published and in my hands, and I had a message from Jerry Beck the next day, which made me, sort of like shiver, because I'd thought of the same thing 24 hours before. It needs an index too, and it's going to make it another 100 pages at least, even if it's in 3 columns, because it's going to have an index to the actors' names in the filmography, as well as all the titles of each cartoon from each studio. And if you look at the end of the '89 book he did with Will Friedwald, just the Warner Brothers titles in alphabetical order in the index alone is a task. So I've already started. I've done the UPA and the MGM list so far.
Oh, Oh, okay. Yeah, it's done in
Yeah.
tiny
I
type.
have a quick
It'll be in
question.
small type. Yeah.
There was one studio that I was a little shocked that wasn't even in the book.
Mm-hmm.
The Van Buren studio.
Yeah, well, there was a real obvious reason for that in my mind is the fact that, first of all, I think it ended in, I think, 1935, and that was the hardest period, 30 to 35, of all the studios to find any paperwork. And then I figured that because our friend Hal Erickson had recently done a book about Van Buren studio itself, which I still don't have.
Actually,
I'm
pretty
sure.
good. It's
Yeah.
good.
Yes,
I
I've heard
finally
it's
got
good.
it. So
Well, yeah, I want to get it because I loved his 2-volume work about TV cartoons, you know.
Mhm.
But anyway, that was yet another one that I wanted to fly maybe in the year before I was published to New York's Billy Rose Theater Collection, because I think that's one of the great libraries in the US for showbiz history. And also, of course, being in New York, it would be the logical one to have stuff on these studios. But then COVID hit, so I wasn't allowed to travel for 2.5 years. So I thought, and a few people, even Thad, people like that, had told me, publish what you've got and tell them what's happened, and say that, further down the track, there'll be more research done, which of course is already happening with the index to the filmography and things like that. So, and then Jerry Beck recently wrote me a thing. He said, it's almost like my first edition of the Warner Brothers cartoons before we did the 1989 follow-up. He said, that was one that we just knew would attract a lot of information over the next couple of years, and it's already happening. And he said, so when you do your revised one, that will be the ultimate.
Right.
And I still have my doubts that there'll be much on the Van Buren studio just in terms of paperwork on voices. Most of the info.
Voice? Like, did you use like the track sheet sometimes of the voice actors? Because like I was just at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library for a capstone I'm writing on cartoon art preservation, and I was looking at all these track sheets from the Mint studio.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things,
sheets,
yeah, like the track sheets of the animators kind of thing.
Oh, you mean like, I like the drafts.
Yeah, the drafts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that sometimes they would have the voices labeled on it, not rarely, but I think for that like a particular example they did, because what happened was they had all these things from Benjamin Harrison, the animator at Mintz. His studio, apparently when Mort Walker had his cartoon art museum, they had donated, his widow had donated everything. So they had all these photos and stuff like that, and it was, and one of the things they had was just like a track sheet of scripts, script from the voices, and they would just say, so they would just write initials or something.
Oh, if you ever find that,
I'll the actors or the animators.
Could be the animator, but to be most unusual, but it could be possible that it could be some of the actors, because I found similar stuff to that in the Walter Lantz collection at UCLA years ago, but it was very scattered.
Yeah.
For every 10 cartoons, only one of them might have voice information, and it was usually in pencil, and it was like a confirmation that the actor had been hired and turned up that day.
That kind of thing. That's what it was.
Yeah, well, if you know anyone who could help me, if they do find any voices with those 1930s Mintz things, I would be perfectly willing to either pay them a fee for photocopying them or whatever, but it would be wonderful.
It was one of the early ones. It was like they had everything possible, from the Crazy Cat, the Jazz Fool, where they had all the storyboards.
Yes.
They had all the story, and then they had all the draft sheets for the animators and everything.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's a real find then, because I think was it Devin Baxter who did one Columbia cartoon so far, or he did a piece about Ben Harrison. That obviously must have tapped into that great big find.
I told Devin about it. I messaged him just the other day about it.
Okay, great. Well, certainly I'll keep in touch with you, but I'd love to get in touch with whoever.
Yeah, the problem with Ohio State, though, is like a lot of archives, you have to be there. They don't let you scan something.
Oh, this is Ohio. I thought you meant a private collector, right?
No,
right.
No,
so Ohio State U. Okay.
Yeah.
But you can't copy. You can copy it, right? You just
they have to. Usually, they want you to be there.
But can you photocopy it there and take your copy with you, or no?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, well, at least they have that. I mean, if you ever
that'd be like a couple of libraries where I've worked in the States, because some of them have a policy where for a fee they will either copy them onto an iPhone and send them to you, or they'll do photocopies for you.
Right.
Like researchers who work at those universities are paid, or I think they get a slight pittance, but then it's up to the researchers such as yourself or me to say, all right, for $90, if it'll be like $1 a page or something, whatever it is. I know I've done that with a lot of the old time radio research that I've done, so I'm sure it'll be the same thing.
Yeah, it's more of anything that's copyrighted, they make you go there to scan.
Oh, I see. Right.
The things that are not, like, if you wanted scans from Richard Outcall's Yellow Kid, that's not going to cost them anything.
Right. Well, I mean, you've seen in volume 1 of my book some of those talent requisitions from the Warner Brothers collection that I reproduced in the middle photographic section. That's the sort of thing I found at Warner Brothers that had voice information, but that was in the 40s where the records were kept better. So to find anything from the 1930s is a real find.
Right.
Yeah. But I think, again, it's like the book comes out and suddenly I hear that there's finally stuff that's being discovered from the Fleischer collection, which up until then, and it is true that it actually happened, that Paramount did wipe out a lot of Max Fleischer's own personal collection of records. But that makes me think there must have been duplicates, because Paramount would have had copies of stuff too, like talent requisitions and sound department reports were just something they wrote on these form sheets every day back in the day. And so much of that stuff just seems to have disappeared into the ether.
I've been writing my capstone on cartoon art preservation for my college capstone paper. So, and one of the things that you notice about animation studios is, with the exception of the one studio that kept everything, was Chuck Jones's later studio that he did at MGM. He kept everything, every art piece, everything, which is great, because you can go to as bad as those commentary cartoons are, the fact that you can have full-fledged, complete storyboards of them with their boards and the side intact is pretty great.
Yeah, that is great.
And you can see them at like the Academy, and they're really well preserved and everything. So, but the problem is, like Warner Brothers, they had that fire. And Hanna-Barbera, Scott Shaw told me that they would just bring dump trucks. So somewhere out there's probably a landfill of animation cells, landfill of animation cells just sitting there.
Well, and the big pity is that Earl Kress passed away so young, and he was the one who had access to the real Hanna-Barbera archives and new stuff, it's in this big salt mine in Kansas or wherever it was, I forget. But yeah, it is a problem. Like I found partial information of these sorts of records for Warner Brothers, MGM, UPA, and Walter Lantz, and of course the Disney archives. Which is a different story, because they had a policy from around about the mid-30s. I think they're pretty good. So a lot of voice stuff is still spotty, but even as I say in the book, the late Dave Smith, who invented the Walt Disney Archives, was kind of red-faced about that, saying, some of our voice records are still a bit patchy, But I think
I'm always amazed when Disney doesn't have something, considering how thorough they were for the longest period of time.
I know that Clampett, Ruth Clampett told me a story that Bob, because Bob was a huge collector of stuff.
Oh yeah, Pack Rat. Yeah.
Yeah. So he had that Mickey. I don't know. You met Clampett, didn't you, Keith?
I never did. I met his wife, Sodi.
But Ruth told me that he had this Mickey Mouse poster that Disney didn't have. And Dave Smith offered him like a lot of money. And he said no. And it was like enough money to where he could buy whatever he wants and more. And he said absolutely not. But I have a question. So it says 30 to 1970. One of the surprising things I saw was that you wouldn't have the cartoons that featured the same voices pretty much, like the Hanna-Barbera stuff. Did you ever plan on doing something like that? The early HB stuff, like
Well, I mean, the book you're holding there is
Yeah.
is pretty much similar to what Leonard did with Of Mice and Magic. It was dedicated to the theatrical cartoons only, and to me, not only did Hal Erickson do a good chapter on voices in animation for his 2-volume set about TV cartoons, but I had toyed with the idea of doing. Then it would be repeating a lot of information that was in my first book of The Moose That Roared, with that filmography of all of the Jay Ward stuff, and again, I think really the TV cartoons to me are just like a different animal in one sense, So that was my intention, to just do this and dedicate it to the theatrical era, which kind of had that cutoff point. I mean, they're approximate. Really, it goes from 1928 to say 72.
Right.
I could put it in my book that I'm working on. I didn't tell you about this one, so I'm working on it. It's TV cartoons that time forgot. And Jerry
You're
Beck.
welcome. I was the one that begged him to write it. That basically put a chisel on his neck to write it.
Well, I didn't want to. Well, I was in the middle of the Mad Book, but now that that's kind of ending and almost being published, my brain is like free to think of other ideas and concepts. And it was the overly mentioned Jerry Beck that said, why don't we do a website on this? And it's like, I don't have time to do a website on this, Facebook and stuff, and he got me to do it. And then I started working on the book. I unfortunately got respiratory ailment, not COVID, in the last couple of weeks, so I haven't been working on it. I haven't been working on it for the last couple of weeks, but
sounds like you're over it though, because your voice sounds healthy.
But I only did one show when I was in the height of my sickness, and it's a very short show, and it's not like I'm gasping, but I feel miserable anyway. But that one's in the past, and we're here, and I'm doing fine. But I kind of separated it out. I'm trying to use Of Mice and Magic as the template for the TV cartoons. I'm not covering every studio. Like, for example, I'm not covering Jay Ward except for just cursory mentions, only because you covered it. Why do I need to recover it? So, and I'm not covering Hanna-Barbera, I'm not covering Filmation. So it's all the smaller studios that probably never will get a book unless somebody's really like, I need to make the book about Hal Seeger. It's like, I need to make the book about
Fred Griffin.
TV spots. What? Which one?
Fred Griffin.
Yeah, Fred Griffin. And it's like,
and wasn't he also to do with Roger Ramjet?
Yeah,
which is one of the classic TV cartoons of all time. Yeah.
So
but did you ever get the old? Just interrupting you for a second, the old little tiny journal called Mind Rot, which became Animania?
Yes. In fact, I gave Kamden one for free. You never saw one before, and
they're great.
I had 2 copies of it because I think it was Dave Maroons that actually sent me a second copy, and I said, I know somebody
Crusader
who would
Rabbit?
like this.
Yes. That was the Crusader Rabbit issue you were just holding up?
And that was the first one I ever got, was that one.
Oh, okay.
And I've since gone back and gotten most of the earlier issues.
Good, because there is a very good Hal Seeger interview.
Yeah, I got that one. Yep.
Yeah,
in fact, I quote from it.
And
the only thing I'm upset about that is, like, I go, Jerry, you didn't ask about such and such, but you can't go back, It's like,
and I kept bothering Mark, and I'm like throwing out these weird, obscure TV studios that Strum Pats is sending me.
Yes. Yep.
And I'm like, what about Top Cell? What about various random small studios? And he's like, all right, stop. All right.
I had to cut it down. I mean, it's I'm sure even on theatricals, I'm sure Jerry Beck and Leonard Maltin had the discussion way back when. Should we put a chapter about David Hand? Should we do a chapter about, John, what's his face? Sutherland, should we do it? And they said, no,
even
no.
to Patty Freeling too, because I didn't, apart from that sidebar, I didn't put their filmography in that because Jerry had done a pretty good filmography of the studio in his Pink Panther book, which I think preceded your one.
Yeah. And then you gave me thanks for mine. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, of course. In fact, I loved rereading. Yours was very convenient because it lumped a whole bunch of interviews together in one easy source, rather than go hunting in old drawers and files and things. But no, there was, even in my book, because I kicking myself now that I left out the John Sutherland studio in the appendix where I had the Republic cartoon, the It's a Grand Old Nag. And because I found with John Sutherland stuff from the late 40s, he used a lot of radio actors that were never in other animation, and they really should have been, like Joe Kearns.
That's where Bill Scott first did his voice, according to Amber's documentary, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and also he did that one at the first motion picture unit in the war, position firing the little, I think it was a little Japanese enemy character.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, Sutherland was where Bill Scott did all those scripts and things. But
that was me who wrote that Sutherland part of Amber's documentary. That was supposed to be a lot longer. That was supposed to be a lot longer. They had to cut pieces of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, again, I wish some of those Sutherland cartoons could be restored, because they've got great animation. And they use Frank Nelson from the Jack Benny Show and great voices like that in almost every one of them, plus a few of the regulars like, Pinto Colvig and that. But they're kind of underappreciated, I think, even though they're all to do with big business. They're very good cartoons.
Yeah.
Mark, I don't know if you know this, but Mark actually tried to get a Sutherland book made, but they turned it down.
Yeah. Maybe I could talk to Ben again, because he's the one I offered it to.
Right. Yes.
But that's instead I did the cracked book. That's what happened at that time. Right. But there is a lengthy Sutherland article, if you haven't seen it, in an old issue of Hogan's Alley. So
I have that one. Yeah,
I don't remember which issue it's in, but I do. And unfortunately, and I don't know if he's passed or anything, but I was in contact with his son at the time, and he gave me all this great information, which I still have copies of, but and not everything got in the book, but I lost track of where he was, so it's like. But that's also been 15 years ago, so who knows?
Yes. Well, if you ever do find any little records of the voice credits for those Harding College ones, let me know, because Yelp and myself know most of the voices, but there's about two that are totally stumping us. It's like some on-screen actor or somebody who wasn't a voice man,
Do you have, Keith, Mark knows I have all of them. I'll continue to have all of them, but do you have Steve Stanchfield's Mid-Century Modern Blu-ray?
Yeah, I have I have two, volumes 1 and 2, and I think there's been another one since, hasn't there?
It's in the making. I know that because I've already pre-ordered it.
Yeah, I love them, and they look good on them. Yeah,
those are the best restorations of. I think if you have every Thunderbeam Blu-ray or DVD, you can pretty much fill out most of the Sutherland.
Yes, like the Snafu Blu-ray is great, and so is the Willy Whopper one. There's a couple I still have to get. And I'm really waiting for the Flip of the Frogs, only because it looks like it's going to be the ultimate word,
Yeah.
Okay, so Keith, I have a couple questions on the book.
Sure,
what was the hardest voice out of everything in the book that was hardest to nail down or track down, in your opinion?
Yeah, I believe it was in the early days when we were the late Hames Ware and I were researching. It was Kent Rogers, because not only did he die very young in World War II, but he'd done so much in such a short time, and there was literally nothing about him until the age of the internet and being able to source little tiny items in newspapers became a thing. But in the 90s, when we were doing all of this, it really was about a 2-year process of elimination using our ears and a couple of radio appearances, and it was like, but if you listen to the quality in this character in the two bats, I can't even think of the title, the MGM cartoon, Bats in the Belfry, and it sounds exactly like this narration at the opening of this Tex Avery cartoon. And finally, we were able to just record audio of just the Kent Rogers voices that were mysteries to us, and then when he produced his letter that Bob Clampett had sent him years before, where he said, I used Kent Rogers as the voice of Horton the elephant, and he finally found that and said, this has been sitting in my house for 2 years and I didn't even know it. And of course, that quality where he said, I did what I said, and then suddenly it was like, wow, that is the same guy doing all these voices and for Walter Lantz and all of this. And then later on, it was confirmed in the early 2000s when Bob Miller and a couple of guys started trawling through newspapers, and that around the same time Yelp appeared, and he's a great trawler. I'm not, and it was the best part about it was our ears had proved to be 100% accurate in that instance, because sometimes that can prove inaccurate, and it sounds like some other person with the same voice quality, but each one of them proved to be confirmed, like he was the voice of Woody Woodpecker sped up after Mel Blanc left for Warner Brothers.
How would they have confirmed the Bugs Hardaway thing that when he did it though? Because did anybody know what he even sounded like?
Well, if you play those tracks slowly, if like mechanically slow them down, you will hear once he takes over that's why he when it's sped up, it does sound like that funny sort of delivery, like that. All the words are. So it's like when you hear, it's like, oh, look at this. I think I'll go inside. Because I think he was directed, not being an actor, he was directed to just do it bit by bit, and we'll speed it up, like not double speed, but triple speed the voice. And it's going to sound like a zany cartoon character.
By the way,
so anyway, there is a Mike Barrier transcript that I had read where he interviewed Walter Lantz, and Lantz simply confirmed that Bugs Hardaway took over on the Barber of Seville.
I think that Bugs Hardaway's son is still around, by the way.
Wow.
I think so.
Because he's another one that the original guy, Hardaway, would have been a fascinating person to interview, but he died in 1957, and he would have had so many stories of the earliest days.
He, either his son or his grandson.
Right. He could be a grandson.
There was some interview online of someone doing a public speaking, and it's the last name of Hardaway. But I was doing research because I'm like Yelp very much in researching, because I take about 6 months to write one thing, because
I'm slow in that sense. Yeah, I'm very slow.
Because I'm deep diving the research where I'm having 17 interviews for just a simple end of the year capstone paper, and I'm like, you don't need to do this. I'm like, yes, I do.
Well, if you like that, that's great, because it's a safety thing too, because you can then get various opinions and really arrive at the truth.
Exactly.
Yeah, but a lot of memories can be colored too,
But when I was looking at something for like my next cartoon research article, I pulled up and I just randomly came across an interview, I guess, with someone with the last name Hardaway, and he says my dad or grandson created Bugs Bunny, and it was like in 2018 when it was made. So he's still around, probably.
Yeah, and all that authorship about who created Bugs Bunny, because I think he was the most popular cartoon theatrical character of all time. And each one of them has a kernel of truth in it. Each one of them were. But then the person who I'd love to have interviewed was Rich Hogan, who's the story man credited on Elmer's Candid Camera and A Wild Hare and all of Tex Avery's first 10 MGM cartoons. And he died years before. And I think he had a lot of input that we still don't really know about,
I think, though, that Charlie Sorensen, if you have his book, the book on him, Cartoon
Yes, I do.
Charlie,
yeah.
There is a little bit of that, and that made me just go, huh?
Yeah.
Because I know that they credited him with creating Droopy. Because the story went that I told Mark this on his podcast when we did it with Strum, where he lent the design to Avery while he was at MGM. And he was at MGM from like 36 to 39.
Right, yeah.
Before Avery was there.
Oh, yeah.
So the idea that he'd lent that design to Avery seems really off.
Yeah.
I think, there's a lot of the guy, the academic guy who wrote that Thorson book, I think kind of willed a lot of stuff into Charlie Thorson. I think Charlie Thorson had a lot of talent, but I think he was a model person and a designer who, like everyone else, had a tiny bit of authorship in what became Bugs Bunny. But, the fact is that to me, the most interesting thing about Bugs Bunny that's emerged in the last few years is that Motion Picture Herald review of Harum Scarum, where it was proved that he was named officially Bugs Bunny in the trades, but not by the public for about at least another year. it's so difficult to go back into the mists of time, and everyone's memory is very selective about what they were doing when those cartoons were in production. It kind of becomes the researcher's role to then synthesize all of that and arrive at a conclusion, to me.
Right. There are some people that, like, there are some historians who says that it was 38, and there's some historians that say it was 40.
Well, I mean, 38 was probably when Harem Scarum was in production. It was released in 39. But really, that first rabbit cartoon, I do believe Bob Clampett, in the sense that he had some gags left over from Porky's Duck Hunt, and they were incorporated into the Porky's Hare Hunt, because they're so similar and so zany, like the embryonic Daffy and the embryonic rabbit. But the only guy who's credited on Hare Hunt is Howard Baldwin, who's I think related to another Baldwin that we know in the animation field.
Yes.
Can't think which one.
I've spoken. Is it Gerard Baldwin you're referring to?
To which one?
Gerard Baldwin.
Yes, right.
I had to speak to Gerard Baldwin a few times on the phone. He was very nice. I called
him. He was. Yeah, he died recently, didn't he?
Yes, he died recently. When I tried to do that June Foray project, I called him on the phone. He's like, "Yeah, call me again anytime." So he just says, "Here's my number," and I just called him again once in a while, and I just chatted with him.
Right. Yeah. Well, he was very helpful to me years and years before on the Jay Ward book.
Yeah.
Because he was one of the ones who went down to Mexico with Bill Hertz, and so his input there was, I was there. I saw all of this stuff. Of course, like again, another author's quandary is that one of my problems with that book was that the negative reviews said, "Oh, there's all this stuff about Mexico. It's too much information." So it's like, wow. I'm one of these people that loves all the information, but
that's what I read. I remember one time the first, like, when I first bought one of your books, I was looking to buy one of your books, Mark. I remember, until I just bought it signed. The total television book was one word, TMI, on your review or something like that.
I've gotten that
and I'm like, well, that's just the best part. That's when it's good.
I've gotten that the most on the Dennis the Menace book, and I'm looking at it and I go, yeah, it's a pretty thick book, but it's thorough. It's designed for not the casual fan. If you just like Dennis the Menace as a character and maybe seen cartoon in the newspaper, it's like, don't read my book. But
it's sort of like when
everything.
When I was very young, I used to kind of wonder what they meant when Chuck Jones or somebody like that would say, we did this for ourselves. But now that we're authors, it's sort of like, in a sense, we are writing it for ourselves too. Like Sherlock Holmes on the case,
I mean, I've said this even before I was a book author. It's like, if there are books that I wish I had written, and then time would pass, or that I didn't write. I mean, books that I wish were written. That's what I meant to say. And time would pass, and there wouldn't be a book about it. And it's like, and occasionally, like, wonderful things came out like this, and so I go, oh, good, I don't have to do this one. But they were few and far between, and so I was like, and so I've taken it upon myself when I'm writing my books is it a subject that's been covered to death? If it has, is there a twist on it that I can do that no one else has done? If I can't do that, I don't really want to do it, and it's really hard for me to get into a book. That's why I put off doing the Mad book for years. Ben wanted me to do the Mad book back when I did the Crack book. And I said, I don't want to do a Mad book. There's other Mad books, but then enough time has passed. And I realized they haven't really covered those later years. Now, most people say, "Oh, those are the crummy years anyway," but that's not the point.
I'm a completist. I'm like you. To me, it's all the years are important. But and then again, I think of something like Mad as such a successful thing that it sort of makes sense that I've bought all the books that they're available about Orson Welles, and each one of them has new stuff in it, and there's a whole library, a whole shelf of books that long about Orson Welles just himself and his life and his films.
Billions of books on Disney, and they're clearly every aspect of Disney is written and clear, and every time someone comes out, that's because the studio is so well documented. Didier Guez, every time he writes a book, he just wrote a book on Disney's World Tour, this little tiny tour that he went on. Right.
I know. Well,
Yeah.
I found one of the best things he did was the Walt's People series, and I'm up to number 25 of that. But
25.
it's amazing with Disney books, and that's why I said in my Disney chapter at the beginning, it would be pointless of me to do a little studio history, because it's been done. So let's just discuss the voices he used, from chronologically.
Right.
Right.
And even that's frustrating too, because of the original 1 year of Mickey Mouse, there were other staff members pitching in and doing it.
I consider Walt Disney, I one time described him as like the Lincoln of
Yes.
Hollywood.
Right.
Meaning that there are so many books about him, yet despite the fact that there are so many books about him, about half of them are mythical falsehoods, right?
I can't bear the fact that I've still got
where
Mark
it's
Elliott.
just like Lincoln, where there's a lot of books on Lincoln that are not exactly true.
Yeah.
Right.
There are a lot of books on a bunch of historical figures like that. And the problem with Disney is there's really only like 3 of them, and every one of them has a little bit of problems to it. But also the problem also is you really can't write a book about Disney. That's why he's like Martin Luther King or Lincoln. There are about 1 billion different books on him, and only about 5 of them are any good. And all 5 of them have enough information. You don't need to do another one.
Yeah, and a lot of them are based on so many people's different perceptions of Walt.
Yeah.
Which could be all, there could be, say, 50% who absolutely loved him, and each of them is a slightly different opinion because it's all just their day-to-day stuff. But I hate the books like Mark Elliott's Dark Prince and all of that, because they're the ones that there's something in human nature. If they're not buffs like us, there's something about human beings that they want to believe that horrible stuff. They don't want to hear the accurate stuff.
Yeah, see, I had that book for a laugh. Oops, sorry.
Which is interesting because Babbitt himself, who was obviously not a fan of Disney, said that book is a load of crap.
Yes, that's interesting.
He himself said that everything in that book is untrue.
Right.
And
it's mean-spirited.
They're talking to the extreme.
Yeah, I know, because I remember reading quite a few interviews with Babbitt, and his grievances were accurate, and the Elliott one comes across as just a nasty piece of work,
And the Elliott thing, that I actually bought it from a Goodwill, because I didn't know anything about Mark Elliott when I bought it, and I opened up to a random page and it was like John F. Kennedy and Walt Disney. I'm like, well, I'm gonna look into this first before I start reading this, and I'm like, I'm just gonna give this back.
Yes, I know. Yeah, and there's another book too that I don't care for, but I can't think which one it is. But most of the ones
Disney's World, I think it's called.
Is that
Leonard Mosley? And he spells his own name wrong in the book. Let's see. When did you start research on this, Keith? Was it like way back before you did the Jay Ward book?
And why did you write it? I have that question.
Yeah, why? Why?
Yeah. Well, I think it was, again, like something I was interested in because I am in that field and have been since I was like 19, and have worked with lots of voice people over the years and been fascinated by the whole craft and the technique of it. And then over the years that became more and more of a topic of interest among cartoon fans, simply because there was never any credit except for Mel Blanc. And then by the age of the internet, people did start making a few little discoveries and misinterpreting some information that Hames Ware and I came out with, and putting wrong information up on IMDb, incredibly wrong. And
I've been there. I just had to interrupt. I actually was on the phone with IMDb once, and I had to literally get Noel Blanc to email them just to make sure, hey, this is wrong.
Yes.
I basically had to get Noel Blanc, and he didn't have to do it, but I told him about this. They credited Mel Blanc as the voice of the dog on The Simpsons. This is absolutely true.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I called IMDb, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And I called them, and they're like, what is your proof that it's not there? And I'm like, and I was on the phone with them for an hour trying to explain to them that the information was wrong, and they didn't believe me.
Wow.
I know that I've heard somebody else say that recently, that I know who it is, the guy doing the Puppetoons.
Leibowitz?
Yeah, Arnold. Yeah.
Yeah.
He said that even though some of his guesses are wrong, but he did say that he was trying to research the voices of the puppetoons, and I was stunned at that because I figured he had so much of George Powell's paperwork that he would have found all the reports on the sound recording. But it sounds like that you have to really somehow dig in some West Coast Paramount archive to find all of that. Because I'm also trying to find out who did the voices in some of the Speaking of Animals, Jerry Fairbanks shorts too. But anyway, to get back to the answer, it really, I think the research began in '78, really when that Funny World article came out called "The Moving Drawing Speaks," and that was Hames Ware and this English guy Graham Webb. And I joined up with them in '94 because I'd been doing the same research myself in Australia, being fascinated with the voice artists and so on, and finding the connection with old time radio, which to me just now you look back and it just makes common sense because they were both in Hollywood in that back in the day. You know, they were all just workaday people cross-pollinating from a cartoon job back to a radio studio and all of that. But it was such a learning process back then because by then, unless you were a collector of the old-time radio shows, fortunately I was, and I loved it. And I would hear these cartoon voices. And then the person who really spurred me on to do the book, strangely enough, was Chuck Jones, because he used to hate questions about it because with his ego, he couldn't stand not being able to answer something. And sometimes he just couldn't remember voices, you know, whereas Clampett had the most photographic memory. It was almost infallible. Sometimes there'd be a couple that might be wrong. I remember reading the Mike Barrier interview that was published in '69 when he was talking about Tin Pan Alley Cats and how he remembered going in to see the music recorded for that by Eddie Beale and his hand-picked cast of black musicians in the morning. And here it is 40 years later, and I'm at USC in the Warner Brothers archive, and I find the sheet for that cartoon, and sure enough, it says 9:30 a.m. And it's like Bob Clampett remembered exactly, you know. And but Chuck Jones was the one who really spurred me to do the book because when he was in Sydney, I'd just seen the cartoon Daffy Duck and the Dinosaur, and I wanted to know who did the little Jack Benny sound-alike voice because I had no idea. I just knew it wasn't Mel. You know, that who said, gee, well, gosh, I'm tired first thing in the morning, you know, that voice.
And
I said, I know he's trying to be Jack Benny, you know. So he was in a radio interview with me. I was sitting next to him because that was when Warner Brothers studio stores were going all over the world back. This is 1990. And I said to him, oh, just before you leave, would you happen to possibly remember 1939 who did the voice of Casper Caveman? And he looked up at the ceiling and went, oh yes. He said that was Jack Lescoulie. I remember asking him, I phoned him up again just to double check, and I said, you mean Jack Lescoulie, who later on went on to be the host of the Today Show in the '60s? He said, yeah. He said back then he was a struggling actor and he used to play tennis with Phil Munro, the animator. So it's like these weird connections. If only they were all still alive, I could ask them a million things, and that would probably be one of the weird things that triggers the answer, you know?
Right. I mean,
so that from that point on, I thought I'm going to get this down, and Hames Ware had joined me by then, and he was really thrilled that somebody else cared about all this sort of arcane sort of stuff, and he and I both at the same time said, you know, I wonder if there's a book in this, because I know it's very much an area of animation that's only a small part compared to the months of work that the animators do and the layout people and the storyboard. But we both looked at each other and said, yep, I think a book is on the cards, you know. So that's where it happened. Now, I think from 1994 onwards, when he began doing articles in Animato called Hearing Voices. That was a column.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
A couple of years. Yeah. His first one was about sniffles. And again, it took another 7 years to really get the accurate answer to that. And that was because somebody finally, through the internet, contacted Jerry Beck. And it was the son of the woman who did Sniffles' voice, you know. We knew it wasn't Sarah Berner, and we knew it wasn't Bernice. So it was this gal called Margaret Hill, who later her married name was Margaret Talbot, but she only did 2 years because then she retired to have a family. and that's why you hear the Sniffles voice in a few Walter Lantz cartoons. I think she used it once for Andy Panda.
Oh yeah,
and he said, if I can ever find them, I remember when I was a kid seeing there were payment stubs that her mother kept from Walter Lantz and Leon Schlesinger, and boy, if I could find them and scan them, that'd be a real find. So there's a very long, convoluted answer to why I wrote the book.
Right.
It turns out, strangely enough, with the two generations of cartoon buffs now, that there was an audience for it. Because in those days when we began, Hames and I said, well, let's do it, but there'll only be two people in the world who'll ever buy it.
Well, that's why I say it's handy with Jerry Beck and Will Friedwald's Looney Tunes book, because you go through that book and it has a synopsis of the cartoons, and it might say a few voices that are obvious, like a Beep and a Darrett, but then they're going, well, it's that announcer voice again, that is in all these other cartoons, but they never give name credit, and you're like, who is it, Jerry?
Yes.
And so then your interest is piqued. And then this is the worst part. And I'm sure you discovered this because of being an old radio show fan. You hear the same voice on a radio show and they don't give him credit there either. Or you'll see an old commercial and it'll be there. It's like, who is this guy?
That's why one of the best things I ever found in the mid-90s was these old issues of the National Radio Artists Directory, because they were like those Academy Players books. They had a picture and recent credits, but then they'd have specialties at the bottom of each entry, and it said specialties like funny accents, loud yells, cartoons, and it's like, so then you do a little bit of back research and realize, yes, that's the voice that I heard, so there's a name for it. A lot of this was just so piecemeal. It was such a specialized subject that it had to be researched in piecemeal fashion. But once you found some person, that sometimes took care of 20 to 40 cartoons, because it was the same person in each one of them. So it was like, that chunk has now been solved.
That's always my issue when I'm watching the Flintstones reruns, because they never have the right end credits on them.
I know. When that Blu-ray came out, I was led to believe, and it was false information, that they had found all the original credits and they were going to be inserted on the back of all the first two seasons.
So it'll be like, the random episode where it's like the Gruesomes, and it's like credited with Jerry Mann right at the end, and I'm like, who's Jerry Mann? And God bless. And now I grew up with the internet, and I was only 5 years old when Yelp introduced his blog. I might have actually been like 9, but so I was able to immediately pull up who's Jerry Mann, right?
Yes,
so I have that benefit because I'm young. But
that's understandable. I felt the same way when I was your age and just getting interested in all of this, and of course there was even less stuff to look for in those days, but somehow, God, I can remember going into public libraries and handwriting stuff out of bound issues of Variety and stuff back then, before you could do scans and things. We all find a way, but I know Jerry Mann. And then, of course, when I started hearing him in the 1940s on very few radio shows, we heard him in one MGM cartoon. I think it's called A Stork's Holiday, and it was one of the same voices he used in the Flintstones, like in 1960. So here he is back in the 40s, and it's Hanna-Barbera.
I'm just curious.
Which one?
Was it of a stork?
No, the stork was Pinto Colvig. I think it was there was a Walter Winchell radio voice, and he'd done that in one of the Flintstones as a radio voice. And also on one Walter Lantz cartoon that he was credited on. But he was a guy who was often out of town. But Hanna-Barbera were loyal to him, because after they used him in the 40s. In fact, I think I mentioned in the book, that's right, I found a file on him at the Billy Rose in New York, and it did have some clippings of when he was between stage engagements. He got a job at MGM, and he thought he was going to be on camera, and then that contract lapsed. So while he was there, he took a job in the cartoon department, and he was writing gags and being available for voices, because he'd been on stage all his life. And so you often hear him in some of the Tom and Jerry's, like the Zoot Cat, And he's the voice on the radio doing a kind of very exaggerated Walter Winchell saying, "That's right. That's exactly right, boy. You listen to me," and it is very much like one of the voices he did in 1960 on the Flintstones. So, boy, they were loyal to him. But then I think he ended up going on Broadway, and he was never available in Hollywood. But I think in the 50s, a couple of times, he was one of the voices for Spike the Bulldog.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were just loyal to him.
I know that I got Evanier to help me fix the other IMDb credit that I actually got Evanier to help me fix.
Right.
Was the first Yogi Bear short, which Mark, you and I have talked about on Anthony's podcast.
Three Little Pigs.
Yeah, the Three Little Pigs one on their own show. The wolf is voiced by Dawes, right? He's got that Phil Silvers kind of voice to him, right?
Oh, like the Hokey Wolf one.
Yeah.
Right.
Kind of like, but in the first Yogi Bear show, the pig short, but they credit Jerry Mann for some reason. IMDb does.
Wow.
And I honestly think they just says, well, the Dawes has done enough. Let's just credit Jerry Mann. And I emailed Evanier, and the next day it was fixed.
Yeah,
I don't know if Evanier did anything about it, but the next day it was fixed.
Now, are you saying that this was like the first episode of the half-hour Yogi Bear show?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll have to go re-watch them. I got those DVDs that came out a few years back, and I'm assuming it's on that one, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, because I always like to check. There's somebody, I think it might have been Yap, who said that Dawes Butler had done a Fred Allen impression, and he mentioned the title, and it was a Huckleberry Hound episode, and it was one of Dawes's best impressions, because he did it for me once in person at his house, saying how much of an influence Fred Allen had been as he was growing up, and sure enough, it's in that Huckleberry Hound cartoon. I must have forgotten because I hadn't seen it since I was a little kid, but I think from that Huckleberry Hound show they did voice credits, but occasionally there would be a Quick Draw of McGraw episode where they tried somebody else, and they'd already made up the standard show credits for that series.
Right.
So I think it was I know the later Flintstones that survived from it. I think season 3 onwards have the correct credits at the end of each episode, right? It's the first 2.
It's the Rise and Shine.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Same with Top Cat too. I think unless they've done all the real Top Cat voice credits at the end.
I don't think they fixed that one. They did fix Johnny Quest. They did fix the Jetsons on the Blu-ray.
The Jetsons was the one I was worried. Yeah. Because on the original DVD, the Jetsons just had one standard card.
No, you have to get the Blu-ray, and it has all the commercials and everything.
Yeah, I've got the Blu-ray of the Jetsons. Yeah.
I have a question for you. So, when I was doing my June Foray project, which I know both of you, I contacted both of you about. So I read countless interviews, and one of the June Foray I even mentioned on an interview before, because apparently she's mistaken for this enough to where she had to mention it. Where did the rumor that she voiced the Red Hot Riding Hood come from?
Oh, again, it's just, I think some young cartoon fan who probably had heard that June Foray was the woman of 1,000 voices, so therefore it must be her, because she didn't start doing, she did one cartoon that she'd forgotten about in 1943 for Chuck Jones called The Unbearable Bear. And then that same year she did one Walter Lantz Oswald the Rabbit revival called The Egg Cracker Suite. And then she didn't do any more cartoons until she remembers the first thing she did for Disney, like in Cinderella or whatever it was. In 49, I think they recorded that. But I think, again, it's sort of like when the IMDb first came out, they had The Fox and the Crow, which was, the Columbias from 1941 onwards. And after the Mel Blanc did the first one, because everyone recognizes his voice, they had Paul Frees, as the Fox and the Crow. And of course, it was Frank Graham. And Paul Frees wasn't even in Hollywood back then until after World War II. So it's like these facts were the bane of our life. And once we started doing the serious research, the most maddening thing of all was that people still thought we were wrong and their guesses were right. It's frustrating to the hilt.
Which I've read, and I think she pointed that out in 2 or 3 interviews where she had to literally say, I was not the voice of Red Hot Riding Hood.
Yes, yes. And these people, if only they'd known, because in that trade publication, the Radio Artists book in the 40s, every issue has Sarah Berner's picture, and she says "voice of Red Hot Riding Hood." You know, so all they had to do was find a copy of that, and there's the information confirmed. So it's a constant thing, and of course there's still so much we don't know in the wide history of all of this stuff that goes way back.
Out of all the studios, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask anyway. Which studio uses the widest variety of talent?
Well, I would go so far as to say Walt Disney.
Really? Okay. I was thinking Warner Brothers. Even with Mel Blanc, it just seemed like they used more incidental voices than other studios.
Yeah, they did. Although, really, Walter Lantz really used a heck of a lot of people back in the 30s and 40s. And in the 30s, boy, his Oswald the Rabbit cartoons, especially once they started getting dialogue, they are zany because it's almost like they did this on purpose just to amuse themselves around the studio. Tex Avery and Cal Howard and all these people. Yeah, because in several of those early talking Oswalds, he does the first line's obviously done by a female singer with a really high voice, so you think Oswald's a little girl voice. The next line's done by a guy with a deep voice. Then it's done by a guy with a sped voice, and then a woman with a sped. And it's almost like, are they doing this to just screw with the audience's mind, or are they sitting around, rolling around on the floor, clutching their stomachs, laughing their heads off? Wow. That was the quirkiest use of voices for about 3 years at Lance when they were all very young.
I have a question.
Sorry, Kim.
I have a voice question for you. So Freeberg will tell the story that he voiced Porky Pig in a cartoon.
Porky Pig.
Yeah. Is there any truth to that? I don't know.
I've never heard a Porky soundtrack in my life that Freeberg did the voice. No, not at all.
He did it on a record or something, but I haven't heard anything.
May have, like he did with Mickey's voice on that Mickey's birthday for Capitol.
Freeberg told that story.
Unless he's confusing it with Three Little Bops or something.
Yeah, maybe he meant Three Little Bops and he got it confused in his mind.
Yeah, but Freeberg
was he older then? Was he older when he said this, or younger?
Yeah, Freeberg told that story when he was older.
Okay, so the mind might have been going a little bit.
Well, don't forget also on that volume 2 of the Looney Tunes Golden collection, he was doing the commentary for the first Three Bears cartoon, which Kent Rogers did, the dumb kid, and Freeberg thought it was him. Thought it was himself, and it was like, I don't believe this. He can't tell the vocal difference between his own Junior Bear and Kent Rogers one.
Well, especially like you remember lines that you've read before, right?
Right.
Like
yes, that's right.
Like I don't know. I assume you have like a copy of the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle script sitting around somewhere.
Upstairs somewhere.
Yeah.
I have June's copy under my bed.
Oh, you do?
That's
cool. I do have June's copy of that script.
But you probably kind of remember lines just because of going over it and doing it, right?
Yeah.
You know,
and seeing it a few times. You remember,
exactly. Yeah. I'm not saying memorize it, but I'm sure it would sound familiar to you if you heard your own voice track versus, say, Bill Scott. You know.
Well, yeah, and also most voice people like that, especially ones who specialize in a range of characters, tend to have a really good ear about their own voice print, you know, and it's like, oh no, that's not me. I can tell that's not me. It could well be that he was pretty into his senior years and a little bit dotty. And secondly, Stan Freeberg had, to be perfectly blunt, a very big ego. Very healthy ego. Yeah, well, that was one thing that I did. But apparently, when he and Paul Frees got together, it was like the battle of the egos.
You sound like when he's in Green Christmas.
Yes, that's right. Yes, but sometimes he'd use that kind of voice. Almost, it was like his real voice, but it was a character as well.
Yes, exactly.
It's almost like, Stan, don't do that, you know. But Paul Frees was like he would play on it like Al Jolson would play on an ego, you know. And I remember being at a Jay Ward session. I was very privileged to get to see one of them, and Paul Frees would come in late, and he was like a short little guy, but he had this enormous ego. But it was like a joke with him. He did it on purpose, just to get a laugh or get a reaction. And he'd come into the studio and do a little tap dance that he had remembered how to do as a youth. And he'd suddenly say, "On your knees, everyone, the Emperor's here." And Bill Scott would say, "Oh, hell, Paul, for God's sake." You damn feather bedding actors.
In the course of doing this book, I assume you did this. Did you get to listen to like original tape archives or anything like that, or is it just listening to the cartoons themselves?
Well, the cartoons themselves, with the tape archives, that was more the Jay Ward era, because Bill Scott gave me permission to borrow each of those huge 15-inch reels of audio tape and dub them, so that I could have a chronological set of listening to each session and seeing how things developed. He kind of knew, like when I first met him, I think I mentioned in the Moose That Roared that I went to lunch with him, because I was only 19 then, but
right.
I'd been sending stuff back and forth to the studio, and he said, "My God," he said, you know more about our stuff than we do." And I was just like this hobbyist, you know. Yeah. But he did say at that lunch, "One day I predict that you will write a book about us." And of course, being 19, I was thinking, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'd love to see that happen." I had no idea that 30 years later I did. And he was gone. Unfortunately, the biggest disappointment of my life was that Bill Scott was one of the great guys I knew, and he didn't get to see the book.
Right.
I talked to Skip Craig every 2
Yes, I know. He's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah, at least every 2 months or something like that. Yeah. So he so literally I basically have him on speed dial.
Yeah. But you say hello from me the next time you speak.
Yes. He told me that when he first met you, you were also collecting radio shows from him.
Yes. Oh yeah. And he was the first guy who supplied him, because in the old Dudley Do-Right Emporium, where he would sometimes be behind the counter when he wasn't doing editing, he had a little catalog from his own personal collection. I think he got into recording old-time radio shows because he remembered and liked to hear people that he knew from the studio, like William Conrad and Paul Frees, but also because he'd been the world's biggest Spike Jones fan and had traveled with the Spike Jones band and had all the old Spike Jones radio shows that nobody else had. And I came in on that visit when I was 19, and Jay Ward's wife said, "Oh, the radio shows are really done by a guy called Skip Craig, and he's in the little building next door." And I said, because I was such a fan of the shows, I went, "Oh, you mean the editor that you see his name in the credits?" And she was like, I think it was one of the first examples of being bugged by one of these young fans who, it's like that old William Shatner sketch on Saturday Night Live, "Get a life." Get a life. I'm sure that's where that expression originated, that sketch.
Pretty much, yeah.
But anyway, I met Skip, and he was in there and playing a Johnny Dollar episode while he was editing film. How he could listen to 2 sound sources at once is beyond me. But I came in, and when he turned the tape off, I was just telling him who I was in town, and I'd written to Doris Butler and Bill Scott and all that, and I knew them, and he was quite taken by this young Australian voice saying that he was a Jay Ward fan. So I started doing the voices out of a recent commercial that he'd cut together, a Quisp and Quake commercial, with Bill Conrad saying, "Why so sad, Mama?" And so he became a booster for me really early on. I remember when he said, "I bet you can't do my voice," because he had this kind of because if you listen to our Miss Brooks, the old radio show, there was a guy called Leonard Smith, and he was an actor who played this character who was a kind of a slow-witted student at Madison High, called Stretch Snodgrass. And when Skip and Corey Burton came with me, I also knew him on that trip, and we were both young but doing all these Dudley Do-Right and all these voices. And Skip was just, his mouth was open saying, "Boy, you guys are the next generation." And he said, I bet you'll never be able to do me." And he said, I don't have a voice. He said, "I just sound like Stretch Snodgrass." So if you ever listen to an Al Miss Brooks show, you'll hear like what he meant.
Yeah.
I was talking to Skip, and he said he was telling me, he says, I was telling him about comics. We're talking about comic strips. And we're just talking about comic strips we both liked.
Right.
And he says, I remember when I was a kid, because he was born in 1930. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So he was actually a lot younger than Ward and Scott, right? Because he was
about 10 years younger. Yeah.
Yeah, he was the young guy in Spike Jonze's little group too, right?
Yeah,
He was
the
the
band
kid
boy.
there,
Yeah.
right? He was the kid.
Yeah.
But he was telling me, he says, I remember when I first got one of those issues of Famous Funnies. Says I got a whole stack of them, and he says, then I got rid of them.
Yeah.
Looking at it now, why did I do that?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, a lot of these old timers used to think, boy, I'd make a lot of money on that. But he was a great help, because Skip had such an accurate recall of everything, and he insisted on, if I'd show him a half completed draft of a chapter back in the early 90s, he'd say he'd pencil very neatly little tiny corrections that just made the chronology slightly more accurate.
He's 91. He's a little bit harder of hearing, but he's still got a great memory.
Well, yeah, I remember I saw him on that multi hookup that we all did for Amber's Bill Scott thing. And he waved at me. He said, "Hey, Keith, how are you?" I hadn't seen him for a long time. The last time I saw him was when he loaned me, I think, home burned DVDs that he had of Spike Jonze's old Soundy shorts.
Right.
Which they used in one of the Mel Blanc documentary things, at those Golden Age Looney Tunes collections where they had all those special features that I'm on and Jerry's talking and all this. And all these years, I was just hoping that Constantine and his people sent all that stuff back to Skip, because I gave him Skip's address and all of that. And I had to fly back to Sydney, but I'm sure he did, or I would have heard from him. Hey, where's my stuff?
I'll get after Constantine.
Yes. No, he's very good. I mean, I really love the work that he does.
Yeah.
I really want to know what is that ad? I asked Noel. I literally had to send Noel a clip of the ad, right? And I'm like, what is this ad of him talking to Elmer Fudd?
Oh, yeah.
You know which one I'm talking about?
I remember that.
And I'm like, what is the ad? What is it for? And I was just wondering, what is it for? And I talked to Noel. I've talked to Noel occasionally on the phone too.
Right.
Yeah, and he's like, I have no idea. And he says, I don't remember. He says, I think it's from an airline, which I don't know if that's right.
Could be. Because a lot of times, the people like him would get called in and they'd do their lines, and months and months later, the thing is completed. And he may not have ever seen it on air if it was a short-lived thing.
Right. It's the one where he's talking to Elmer Fudd, you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think I may have even seen that in the dim memories of parts of my memory that recall it. But I did find one source of Noel for the book. It's either in the notes or in the chapter, but it talks about after Mel died. And it was like a quote that he said to some interviewer where he said, he said, to tell the truth, I was never interested in doing voices, which means that when Mel was alive, that whole family thing about Noel's going to inherit all these voices when I go and all this sort of thing, it was more kind of kept up as, keep it all in the family and keep it loyal. But deep down, when he heard Jeff Bergman on Box Office Bunny, I think it was. He met Jeff and said, boy, he said, you really sound like my dad.
Yeah, I know that Noel is a fan of some of them, not a fan of some of the other ones.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, sorry to interrupt. Didn't the rules change around that time, that even if Noel wanted to do it, you couldn't have somebody like a Mel Blanc anymore doing all the voices?
That was the unwritten rule or the unspoken rule, but I think they were worried deep down that if somebody was publicized around the world as replacement for Mel Blanc, and it was all happening at the same time when Mel passed, all the Warner Brothers studio stores were just going to open worldwide, Right. And there was, and also it was 12 months before the 50th anniversary of Bugs Bunny in a Wild Hair. So it was all a lot of Warner Brothers publicity that year after Mel died. And I think they were all, well, first of all, it was the old thing about, they worried somebody was going to gouge them for more money.
Yeah.
And because I think it was only in his last years that Mel Blanc ended up getting some sort of respectable money for all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Certainly when you look at the old pay slips and things that I found from the 1940s, Mel's real money was in the radio series of which he was a regular, because they were national and they were sponsored. So he was being paid, really, he was being paid by the Lucky Strike Tobacco Company. He was being paid by Judy Canova's sponsor and Burns and Allen's current sponsor, Maxwell House. And that was big bucks, because I think his agent in the 40s, there was a national recognition of him much more than in the cartoons. It was on radio, the happy postman, hello, Mrs. Burns. And, you can hear the audience laughter each week. It's sort of like Bill Thompson's voices, like Wallace Wimple.
How about those Capitol records that he did back in the day?
That was interesting though, because because I always thought it was interesting when you hear his voice, when you hear people talking about him.
Right.
But back then, when you hear it, they say, "Oh, he's a star of this," but most people recognize him as the voice of Bugs Bunny.
Yes,
Right.
They started publicizing Bugs in the mid 40s on radio, because by then that rabbit had taken off so popularly that even on his own radio show, they'd say, Mel Blanc, Jack Benny's violin teacher, and then you'd hear him go, Monsieur Benny, and then you'd say another one like the Happy Postman, and finally, and of course, the voice of Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny. What's up, yeah? So then each one got a tiny bit of applause from a studio audience. You realized, he's becoming quite famous even before television.
Right.
Yeah.
The question I had, the question I had was, did those Capitol records that he did way back when do well for him, or were they just kind of like an additional set income and it wasn't that big of a deal?
I think it was pretty much additional income. He was so busy back then. I think the big money, once the 1950s hit and TV came along in the US in 48, I think by 52, they reckon most people had a set in the house.
Yeah.
That's when people like Mel Blanc and Paul Frees and that began realizing we're going to make more money, because they were panicking with the end of radio coming on the horizon. All of them would like Paul Frees' sister said that he was genuinely panicked to the point where for about a few weeks he went to see an analyst thinking, I'm going nuts. I'm so scared about my future. And suddenly they realized that television with made for TV animated commercials with residuals, this was where their future nest egg was, because suddenly they were getting paid much better than they ever did in the theatricals, which were a one-off payment, In fact, Mel Blanc in the 40s was famous for these radio shows and all that, but he was still getting less money for each cartoon at Warner Brothers than Arthur Q. Bryan was getting, because Arthur Q. Bryan was a senior person and he'd had a 10-year longer reputation in radio, so his agent charged more than Mel Blanc did, and he only ever did that one voice.
I know that Noel told me that the only TV cartoon that Mel ever had any fun with was the Flintstones. Yes. Because because he says that his dad liked the cast of the Flintstones.
Right.
He didn't dislike, he says, but after those shows were done, everything just became a job.
As I say in the book, like Hanna-Barbera, even Bill Hanna, who I first worked with when I was a kid, even he kind of jokingly admitted, look, I know the way television works. We are looked at as a sausage machine factory now, producing all these cartoons. He said his favorites remained the first 4 or 5 years of cartoons. Bill Hanna himself, all of them loved and had an affection. I think Joe Barbera was the same. He really retained more of an affection for the days of Huckleberry and Quick Draw McGraw in those early years,
right,
when they were establishing the studio. And I think it did become, I mean, you can tell the writing became very formulaic, and all those things that Mel did, such as Hardy Har Har. None of them were characters that you really cared for. They were amusing heard once, but pretty much just formula.
But admittedly, the voices were what kind of saved a lot of those later shows.
Yes,
like
exactly.
hearing Mel doing Captain Caveman, the character's not so great, but hearing him do it is great.
Yes.
So,
by the way,
yes,
Mark, Heath. So, somebody online decided, Mark, I know I sent this to you just to get a laugh out of you. Somebody online forged. There are a lot of internet forgers. People forge Andy Warhol all the time, stuff like that. Is Mark, you're a member of that group, the Animation Art Hall of Fakes?
Oh yeah.
There's a forgery of Friz Freeling Captain Caveman forgeries.
Wow.
There's no context to it. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
There's no it's just
it's hysterically funny. I feel bad for anybody who's taken in by it and spends big money on something that's a fake, but
And I used to think, even years ago, when the whole mounted cells thing became a new thing in the early 70s, I used to think, well, some of them are just reproductions. They're not the originals. And people, I think, are hanging them up on their wall thinking, hey, I've got some animation history here. But really, I felt sorry for them, because in a way it was pretty much just a thing for Asifa to make some money to fund their events and things.
As far as Jay Ward goes, and animation cells, I was always on a quest to get a Jay Ward cell, a real one, because I know they had the serigraphs signed by Peter Peach.
Right there on my wall, right next to this computer.
And I didn't want a serigraph. I wanted the real deal. I've seen a few things here and there, finally, but I wanted Bullwinkle too, because I know Van Eaton Galleries, he had a couple things from Fractured Fairy Tales and things like that. But
that's right.
Finally,
so much of that stuff was junked in Mexico, unfortunately. But
finally got it. It wasn't from Mexico, because it was from one of the Cheerios commercials, which was animated here. But it's it's just a few Bullwinkle heads. It's the one where he's wearing the bathing suit. It's a Cheerios commercial. He dives off the diving board, but it's just a couple heads, because the body was probably on another cell. But
I had one.
I cherish those, because there wasn't anything else to get.
That's right. They're so rare, and I remember the only one I had was a slightly flaking one of Bullwinkle landing on the ground, like and it was from that opening in the first season where he falls off that awning, and I loaned that to Daryl for the Art of Jay Ward Productions book.
I have a question. So, when I remember when I first got this book, I actually got it at a used bookstore, as you can see, because it says the Marshall County Library on
it. That's the rare version.
Right.
That's the original. Yeah. So, and it's even got the
checkout.
Yes, right.
Which, by the way, when they sell library books, they're supposed to take this out, which means
just avoid that building, or they'll charge you a late fee.
It's either working at a library, I know this either A means it's a late fee, or B means they lost it and they just gave it to a bookstore.
Oh. Because I've seen library book. I have library book versions, and they still have the card in it that you can pull out.
They're not.
I've got a couple.
No. They can have the card in it, but this right here.
Oh yeah, no, I have some with that too.
Yeah,
I remember I got a couple on Amazon Marketplace, and that was the copy I got. It was some person selling me pretty cheap, but selling me a library copy with the card still in it.
Yeah,
that's how blatant it is.
Which Now, I always thought that this was, and then I got Daryl's book,
right?
Which actually got signed by June. My friend Carol, who works at the Chuck Jones Gallery, bought me that for Christmas. Bought me a signed copy of.
That's June's a nice book to have. Yeah.
Yeah, but half the stuff I have is Carol just gives me, because in June, when she signed it, Daryl and June accidentally signed it to Carol Kamden. Carol's one that gave it to me.
Yeah.
Both actually, and then June also signed her autobiography the right way.
Oh,
right.
I thought you were going to say in her last years, her mind started to wander, and she signed it like Little Red Hot Writing.
Right. Yeah. But,
I was there when she did a signing with Daryl. That was at Van Eaton Gallery.
Yeah, Carol would have walked up to your table and says, "Can you sign this for Kamden?" They would have signed it, Carol Kamden.
And then I got Jerry Beck's Peabody and Sherman film.
Oh book. Yeah, right.
And
is that a good book? Because the movie's not. And
well, it depends on your liking of film books based on animated features. I mean,
yeah, that's right.
you know, it's like it's very thorough. I mean, I got it because I like Peabody and Sherman, even if the film is not as good as the original 5-minute cartoons or whatever. You know, it had some good imagery, and that's why. And of course, when Jerry's right there in front of you with a stack of them, it's hard to say, "Nah, I don't want your book. I just want Daryl's book and June Foray's." Sorry, Jerry. You know.
Oh, he admitted to me it was an assignment book.
Yes,
it wasn't a labor of love.
You know? Yeah. I was in class one time in my history class. We had this thing where it's like, you know, tell everything that happened on that date. So I'm picking dates, and mine is only has to do with cartoons or radio or television. It's like, even if it's like, you know, Washington was born on that day, it isn't going to be in my presentation. But someone says, born on this day, Jay Ward, director of George of the Jungle, and I scream in the class, no! I scream in the middle of class, no, that is not right. No.
Yeah.
I had just done something on Don Wilson from Jack Benny, and it was wrong. And I'm like, all right, I have had enough.
I know. I still see an occasional Facebook thing. Yeah. There'll be some Jay Ward group on Facebook that'll say something blatantly wrong. And it's like, one time I just tried to be polite, but I said, have you ever heard of the book The Moose That Roared? Because there's a couple of facts in here. I didn't want anyone to part with money and buy it. I just wanted to correct them, you know.
I hate it.
Sometimes on Facebook it looks like you're being real snippy and superior if you correct people, you know, and it's like so there's that oh yeah, that's that guy Scott, you know, he thinks he's Mr. Know-it-all.
I won't name names, but what drives me nuts is there's a couple of people, because you know I'm the Harvey Comics guy,
right? Yeah,
that's how I kind of got my start. There's a couple of people, I won't name names, so to save them from embarrassment, but they'll ask me questions all the time, and I'll say it's in the book. It's in the book, and it's like I don't mind telling answers, but it's in the book because and I know they own it, and they go, "Oh, I haven't read it," and it's like,
oh yeah, well that's like that. It's like all those annoying people that I've known over the years who want hundreds and free copies of radio shows, and then years later you meet them and say, "Oh, I've never listened to any of them. They're just up on the shelf. I just wanted to collect them." You know.
You mentioned something. Oh, it's what Jerry Beck said. He said I did something work for hire. And before the show, you were asking me current things I'm working on or have worked on. So my most recent book totally is a work for hire, which is Pac-Man, the first animated TV show based on a cartoon. Fellow Ozzy.
I gave Mark a little bit of hell for that. The first, I interviewed Mark, and the very first question I asked was, "Why, Mark? Why?"
Yes.
Look, I can see that there'll be an audience for it, because I can remember when young kids I know who were growing up with Pac-Man. You know?
I didn't want to do it because it's kind of outside my wheelhouse. I'm not a huge video game fan. I mean, I played Pac-Man stuff, but I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I have to have it, you know, and get the Nintendo system and the everything else. So it's kind of, you know, out of my scope. It's like your book, it ends in 1970. You're not going to talk about something in the 80s or 90s unless it was like really whatever. But anyway, I you know, it's Scott Shaw that said, "Oh, I got the perfect person to do it." I don't know why he thought I was the perfect person, but you know, he was very grateful that I agreed to do it. And Ben said, "Okay, let's do it." Fellow Aussie Dean Rankin did artwork on this. So
I've only ever said hello to him. I don't really know Dean.
Okay,
I know Anthony Kodarak very well.
Yeah.
But,
all right.
But
and anyway, so I used it as an excuse.
We have cross paths.
I used it as an excuse, although very slim, to do my complete history of Hanna-Barbera. Although it only takes how many pages? 14 pages, but
well, it's like a summation, and that would be the market that would read that, and that'd be enough for them, I would imagine. I mean, I think back to Hanna-Barbera. There were books I bought in the late 80s. A guy called Ted Sennett, who was mainly a film book writer.
I got that book, and to get it, I literally had to fight with a bookstore owner. My mom had to fight for it with basically, we were in a Sioux Falls, and my mom was like, "Okay, just give us the book," and he said no. And my mom was just like, "Just give us the book," and she had to pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean, when it came out, it was a helpful index of the shows that they did to the end of the 80s. But and I loved the big hard So not big. The large old black and white photo of Doris Butler and Don Messick, like on one of their first ever sessions. They looked like young guys in 1957. But and Bill Hanna, when he came back to Sydney in the 90s, autographed the book for me. But as Jerry Beck and I agreed, 99% of that book by Ted Sennett is like calendar art rather than images from the original cartoons. But it's a useful one to have. I never did get Mike Mallory's book. I meant to get that for years, but
Mike
so
Mallory's book I have signed by Joe Barbera.
Oh, okay. Is it a good one?
Yes, it's good. Yeah. It's like, if you have Jerry Beck's book, Warner Brothers Animation Art, where it's like a book of limited edition.
Oh yes, I have that.
The studio.
Yep.
It's like that. This book right here. I don't know if you have this book.
No.
This book, it possibly is the worst book I have ever read on the history of animation.
Oh,
it's
so thick too. Look at it.
It is awful.
Wow.
I'm sorry, Mr. Fisher, but I'm not a fan. If you're listening.
Okay. Because
I must admit I've never heard of it or the author, but
in my intro, and this since we're talking Hanna-Barbera, I say I recommend 5 books, and it's the Sennett book, the Mallory book, Jerry Beck's Hanna-Barbera Treasury, and then of course Bill Hanna's and Joe Barbera's books.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I figure if you got all 5 of those books, somewhere in there you'll have the whole history, because nobody's ever really written a definitive history. But I think if you get all those pieces, it kind of
I didn't mind that one guy called T.R. Adams did about the Flintstones. That was a good hardcover book.
Oh yeah.
I agree with what Jerry said though, because I talked to Jerry also about the Hanna-Barbera book that it did.
Right.
The problem with I agree with Jerry also said is the book is all stock photographs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's all stock photographs, and it's not, the photographs in the book do not hold up to the standard that you'd want a good Hanna-Barbera book. That's what Jerry's book is.
Yeah.
Jerry's book is that was my epiphany book.
But Jerry's book stops
book when I was 9 years old. And that
was
that's
the problem with
my Bible.
That's going on. Yeah.
And of course, I've talked to Jerry about it before. He goes, well, nothing after Scooby-Doo is that important anyway. Well, okay, you're right. But, as we are all historian completist type people, you always want the whole story all the way till the bitter end where it's no longer Hanna-Barbera and the closest studio.
I would have ended at Johnny Quest. So
even before Taft. Wow.
you're so young to say that. I thought you'd regard people like me as old coots who wanted to end before Scooby-Doo. But that's amusing.
Yeah, because like Tony Benedict says, it's good until Taft took over. It's
yes.
So,
Well, I think Johnny Quest is a great series. That's why
I do too.
Johnny Quest.
Yeah.
And I still like that one, but I still don't have the Blu-ray, and I've got to really get that.
It's good. It's good. That's what really draws you to it when they look that good.
Right. But no, you mentioned in my Cartoon Voices book that the cutoff was 70, but even there I broke my own rule because I finished the Disney chapter and it ends at the Aristocats just as they start using celebrity voices, and that's why I thought this is ridiculous. I've got to write an appendix to this chapter which is about the use of celebrity voices that goes on up until current day.
Yeah. Well, that is the hard part about Disney, because they never really officially stopped. I mean, where is your cutoff when they just get crappy cartoons, or they've still always made shorts here and there, especially nowadays. Every Pixar, every Disney film has a brand new short, so they're doing more than ever.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
which I think that trend began with Roger Rabbit, with the spin-off Little Roger cartoons that they did.
And then you go, well, where do you cut off with Walt? Because Walt said the go ahead for Aristocats. He may not have been there, but and then one could argue he said the go ahead for Beauty and the Beast. So
because didn't the idea of Beauty and the Beast start off well before?
Oh yeah. Well, it was one of many being discussed as a future project. Yeah.
I think
they just never did it.
Tangled was too, though, wasn't it? Like the Rapunzel story was an idea that Walt had.
I haven't heard that, but probably.
I heard something about that, but it rings a bell. But
other ones like Bedknobs and Broomsticks, that was discussed in case they couldn't get Mary Poppins and things like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And even going back to the 30s, there was about 10 features that became features up into the mid 50s. I think even Sleeping Beauty had been discussed in the late 30s.
Yeah.
So
Peter Pan was.
that was a studio that really took their time.
Peter Pan was, because even in the Electric Dragon, you can
Peter
see
Pan,
all the Peter Pan
Bambi.
models.
And then I always think the funniest one is the one
Alice
that
in
never
Wonderland.
got made, that they kept trying as Chanticleer, and then
Right.
it became
Yes.
Rockadoodle by Don Bluth.
Oh, that's
You know?
right. Yeah. And I forgot that Solomon did that book, The Disney That Never Was.
Yeah, that's a great book too.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good book.
Yeah. Well, and then Canemaker did those nice books in the early part of this century, or maybe the late 90s.
Yeah.
But the art of the storyboard and the inspirational drawings.
Mhm.
Because I remember when he did the third of the trilogy, which was Walt Disney's Nine Old Men. I remember Mark Kausler saying, "But how can he have a book about that animation, all of them, when Frank and Ollie said everything about animation in their own book?" Which was The Illusion of Life,
Right,
which was
right.
like the heaviest telephone book you've ever picked up.
Try buying it somewhere else and then taking it on an airplane. That's what
well, I did that on my last trip to the States pre-COVID in 2019 with JB's and David Gerstein's Mickey Mouse book. Bob Miller,
I did that too. That was
Bob Miller picked it up for me in a shop, and then I gave him the money for it, but I had to transport that back on the plane and put it in the overhead compartment.
I had that was my
turbulent.
That was my graduation gift, because that was back when it was really expensive. That was my graduation gift to me.
Yeah, the price had just started.
I don't know if you have that new Popeye book coming out by R.C. Harvey.
No.
R.C. Harvey just passed away recently,
right.
but he and Hermes Press wrote, and hopefully it's finished, right? Because he passed away so suddenly. But it's all about Popeye, the history of the strips, the movies, everything. And it's like a brand new 250-page coffee table book.
All right. The one I guess the one I wanted to get, but I've been holding off, is the Fred Grandinetti one about the TV Popeyes, because I still haven't got the tapes of the old TV show, the TV cartoons.
You have the book, Mark?
I have the Grandinetti book. Yeah, I ordered that right away.
Right.
Because it's funny. People go, "Oh, those cartoons stink," and to go out on a limb further, most people are like, "Well, if it's in color and by famous studios, it stinks." And it's like, oh, come on. And it's like, for me, it's like, because this is why I like your book so much, Keith. I'm a voice artist guy too, in that. The fact that those 60s ones, even though some of them are remarkably bad, they still use May. They still use Jackson. They still use
Jackson Beck. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so it's great because it's their voices again. If you don't like how it looks, turn it off and just listen to it like radio. Illustrated radio, Chuck Jones. Anyway,
here's my thing about it. I like them too for this reason, and I think it is. Mark, you and I have talked about this before, and Mark, I remember you agreed with me about this. Here's the deal. I'm a huge fan of E.C. Segar, and I think that the Fleischers did their cartoons. I love them. They're one of the best animated for us. But a lot was lost when they did them because they had to shorten to that 7-minute format.
Yeah.
And let's face it, that's what it is. Jules Pfeiffer is right. It is basically Popeye versus Bluto. Those are the concept of a lot of those shorts. And those are not the Segar cartoons. The fact that they were able to use characters like Sea Hag finally was great.
In the TV ones,
they use Sea Hag and they use Giesel and stuff like that. So I'm like, yeah, great.
Yeah.
That's what I like.
I remember watching the TV cartoons when I was a kid and enjoying them. And that's why I'm nostalgic for that period of TV cartoons where things exploded from about 58 to about 62. And I was very so I'd like to get copies of them just for nostalgic reasons. I think I not so much the Magoo cartoons, because I think I can remember even as a kid thinking they're very repetitive.
Well, I got all those too. I went through a phase, and some of them are hard to find. I went through a phase where I said, I'm snapping up every animated cartoon DVD from the 50s and 60s of every show,
Yeah,
even if I never saw the
should have done
show.
it with some of
Like I
them.
never
Yeah.
saw Cool McCool. I was too young.
Yeah.
But I have the set now and I've seen it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
I remember I've got to get the Popeye ones because one line that I can remember even as a young kid that stuck with me in my memory was a line for the ages. It was just Bluto for some reason. Brutus got angry with Olive, and he's a guy who calls a woman "you ludicrous nonentity."
I don't remember
Couldn't
that. That's
believe
funny.
they got away with that. They wouldn't get away with it now.
Yeah.
I recently watched all of them in chronological order because I've been doing this thing where I've been going on for about a year. I've been going on these marathons where I just watched every Three Stooges film. And Mark, you can attest to it, and I kept going back and forth with you.
Nice work if you can get it.
I have just watched every Cambria short. This is murder.
And you never will again.
I watched all of the Laurel and Hardy Fox features too, and I remember telling Mark, I'm like, why am I doing this?
Yeah. Well, you know, in the very first one, the Great Guns is the leading man is Dick Nelson, who did all those voices for Walter Lantz, and you look at him and he just looks like some kind of slightly gawky young guy, and you can't even imagine all those funny characters coming out of him.
And I was watching, when I was watching all of the Popeye, Kingfisher Popeye, I realized that there is never going to be a second volume of those Popeye cartoons on Warner Brothers released for Kingfishers because the ones that they release are the best of the lot.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think the ones.
Well, you've just answered my question. I was going to say, have they released a whole chronological set of everything?
To my knowledge, they haven't released all of them in any case, because I have this one set that came out about 10 or 15 years ago from this old label called Koch or Koch,
yeah, I remember
whatever,
yeah.
Koch, and they didn't put all of them on there. And then the Warner Archives one, there's a lot of duplications, but a lot of new ones, but they didn't put them all on there either. So even if you have both of them, you still don't have all of them.
Right.
You know, which is
I remember when I was like 8 or 9 years old, the guy living next door to us worked at this Art Transa cartoon studio here in Sydney, and he took me there because I was already interested in animation, and I saw them drawing Popeye for the Australian outsourced set, and Snuffy Smith as well. So that was, I guess, in 1960, 61.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Did they do Beetle Bailey and Crazy Cat too, or no?
Yeah.
They did?
Oh, okay.
They did some in Australia, the studio called Art Transa. I think it's covered in that.
And then they did the Beatles cartoons too, right? I think
they did a couple of them.
Yeah, because they were a source for. I'm learning this now because I'm working on my book.
Right.
They were a source for a lot of the King Features things because King Features
didn't
have its own animation studio, so they had to outsource it. So
I think Brodax was the guy who had the contract with King Features, and he knew about two or three different countries that were outsourcing American series, including down under here. And then years later, like when I'm out of high school looking for a job, I'm in this office and this girl says, "Oh, a friend of mine works at Hanna-Barbera," and I said, "What, in Hollywood?" And she said, "No, here in Sydney." And my head exploded. Wait a minute, what? And it suddenly made sense because I'd just seen Bill Hanna like 6 months before on an Australian talk show in like late '71, talking about this company he was helping out called Air Programs International. And of course, the surviving animators from there will say now it was like, well, Bill was a great guy, but really it looked like he was down there to poach us all because he was planning to open a wing of Hanna-Barbera in Australia. So when I got a job there, he was my boss for about 6 months, and it was like a dream come true because I took my letter from Doris Butler in with me, and it was enough for him to say, "All right, would you like a job around the studio?" And while I was there, they were animating, remember, quite a good series that almost predicted The Simpsons years later called Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. And they were animating that here in Sydney, strangely enough. And then about 6 months later, I won that trip, as I said, when I was 19 to Hollywood. And Doris Butler said, "Hey, that kid that you knew in Sydney's in town." And Bill Hanna said, "Come over to Cahuenga Boulevard," where they had the studio. And sure enough, they were still recording the voices for season 2 of Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. So I actually sat in on a voice session of that and met Lenny Weinrib, the late Lenny Weinrib, and Tom Bosley.
Yeah.
Tom Bosley.
Marianne.
Oh boy, I remember always thinking he had such a great voice for a one-liner because that other guy, Jack Burns, who played the kind of come on, yeah, we've been sitting here waiting for this damn thing. And suddenly this woman comes out, okay, so who's the next person for an insurance policy? Well, I think it's me, but it may have lapsed by now. And then he ends up as the father on Happy Days, you know.
Right. Was that studio the same one that became Southern Star? Is that correct?
In Sydney?
Yeah.
Gee, it may have, but that Southern Star was always in a different building. But
okay.
By the time it expanded, I think Bill Hanna had long since either retired or the Sydney one also fell into the whole Taft thing, you know. So
right. Okay. Yeah. And then they did, as far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is they did the Funky Phantom also.
Yes, that was the first thing they were working on.
And then Dinky Dog with the later Popeyes that we aren't even talking about, the all new Popeye.
By then I was already into business and I wasn't.
Okay, so they did a show called Dinky Dog, which was actually better than the Popeye cartoons. And
I think that was after I left the studio.
And then they did a show called Drac Pack in the early 80s.
Drac Pack, boy.
So
I think.
I do remember.
Mark, you talked about the Beetle Bailey. Have you seen Jason Witten's book on Mort Walker Conversations?
I have it somewhere. Yeah.
I've heard of the book, but I haven't seen it.
If you pull up the section on those Beetle Bailey cartoons.
Mort
wasn't a fan, and the story he told on that. He's like, every time I hear those voices, I just want to shriek.
Yeah.
Beetle's just all Beetle does is yells, "Hey, Sarge!"
Yeah. It might have been Howard Morris or one of those people. I think
it was Howard Morris.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've talked for an hour and a half, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah, we have too. Boy.
So I don't want to keep going forever and keep you. Well, what time is it there in Sydney?
It's now 20 minutes before 3 in the afternoon the next day.
So it's early.
You're talking back to the future.
Early tomorrow. So when they say there's no tomorrow, well, there's proof.
Like a lot of American guys who'll do a thing with me and say, "Hey, listen, the Kentucky Derby's running right now. Can you tell us who wins?"
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Was that kind of?
Yeah. What is the Simpsons joke in the Bart versus Australia episode? Oh yeah, Marge, we can see the future.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, I guess at this point, I always say this: give a plug for your books again. I'll hold them up. And how people can contact you if they have rare information about voice actors or anything else, and also if you're doing
just Facebook Messenger,
any personal appearances you might be doing the next few months or anything like that. So take it away.
Nothing that you'd know in the States. It's all local stuff. But thank you for the plug. I appreciate it very much. And if there's still some cartoon buffs out there who need to get a Christmas present for the cartoon geek in your life,
get that too.
These books. And this one, of course.
Yeah. And I still need to get the paperback version. You said the paperback version has a few more things in it that is not in the.
It's just a few minor corrections of facts and things, and originally that was edited for me, that book, and they did annoying things like correcting my manuscript so that Gerard Baldwin became Gerald. You know, and it's like I had to tell them that was his name. So in the revised one, that's correct. Minor things like that. Very major to Gerard himself.
All right, and I can't end the show without you doing a little Bullwinkle. Can you do a little Bullwinkle?
Well, it's been a great. I've certainly enjoyed this very much, Mark, and you too, Mr. Spies.
Thank you.
Let's see. Watch me pull a microphone out of my hat or something. I don't know.
I love it. By the way, Keith, if you ever hear an interview with June, the one thing she hated was when people would walk up to her and do that.
Oh yeah,
Bullwinkle voice.
Yeah.
I know Bill Scott used to say that to me because he heard my impression and he said, you do it right. He said so many people. This was the way he said it.
He said they just do a dumb. They think Bullwinkle's just this dumb guy.
Yeah.
He said actually, he said the way I used to describe him, which I put in the book, is he's a smart goof. So everything he said
sounded like a goofy voice, but it came out as almost intellectual.
All right. Well, I thank you again, Keith Scott, for being on the show.
It's a pleasure, Mark, always. And, let's maybe do a follow-up thing about general cartoon stuff if you want, maybe in a year or so, or 6 months or whatever.
Yeah, we don't always have to plug books. We can talk general animation.
Whatever.
We could have Mark Kausler or anybody else back that we've had before, a big round table. And of course,
this is the third one I think I've done as a co-thing, because you've got yourself and Kamden, and I did another plug about my book with Mark Kausler for Yesterday USA, the internet radio show.
Yeah.
And that was a crazy one too, because we had all these people ringing up saying what you just said, do Bullwinkle. It was like do Popeye or do this or that. it became a mimicking show instead of a book show.
I try not to do that with you, but I had
that's
I
fine.
had to get a Bullwinkle out of you.
I always love doing all those voices. So it's like when I first started showing off in front of Skip years ago. I remember when Skip Craig said the Bullwinkle. He said, "You're really good, but can you do Boris?" And I went, "Is get crashing moose again, mister."
You should record an entire script. If there's like if there's an unproduced script out there or something like that, and do all the voices. I don't know if you could do Natasha and
I did a 30-second one for Daryl Van Sitters. When Daryl did his book, he asked me to do the voices for an internet commercial, and so I had to very quickly do the narrator and suddenly go into Bullwinkle, and Boris bad enough, and then and Dudley do right naughties, and it was all in 30 seconds.
Oh wow. The only thing that rivals is like Dan Castellaneta. He did a track once where he did like 5 Simpsons voices.
Right.
So
I have a quick question, by the way. I know we're running late, but
right.
When you when Daryl's book first came out, did you finally did you like what did you think about when it first came out? Because I thought it was awesome.
Well, I knew he was going to do it because he contacted me about artwork, and I was frustrated with my own book because it was decided by St. Martin's Press that they were going to do my book the way they did it, and I gave them a lot of images to choose from, and I gave them my choices, which they used in the book, and I could have killed them because the 50 that they used in my book they lost, or somebody stole them. So they were one-of-a-kind pieces, including a great frontispiece photo of Bill Scott that Bill Scott had autographed to me when I was very young. But anyway, I still had tons and tons of stuff from my collection over the years. And I was able, if you look in the back of Daryl's book, you'll see my name on like maybe 75 different pictures that I contributed to his book. So no, I was very happy. It was almost like the book I wanted to do with color and all that was finally going to come out. So
because I remember reading it, and I remember also reading your book, because I think I read your book when I was about 14, 15 maybe. But I remember reading.
Me too.
But I remember but I remember reading the book, and I'm like, your book is more like, this book is more like profiling the individual artists and directors, but your book was more like also even more focused. There was also that, but even more so focused on writers, the writers and the actors, and because like the background artists and all of those and the people in Mexico are all profiled individually in Daryl's book.
Yeah,
I don't think we had that in your book, which made it like the companion piece to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned a lot of the people in the credits because I found out little facts about them. A lot of them who'd passed away, from people like Bill Hertz, who by that point was still alive. I think he had already passed away by the time Daryl started his book. So I was fortunate enough to get to some of those people before. But I think it was great having his book because it was like at least you could see one sample of each of the artist's own artwork and finally say, aha, now I understand which person did the most fractured fairy tales. And of course it was Sam Clayburgher really was one person who was really created a J Ward look in those cartoons.
I think I know that Harry McCracken's book article on the
statue.
the statue.
Yeah.
I provided him a lot of June's stuff because I have all of everything, all of June's Operation Loudmouth collection.
Right. Yeah.
I'm the one who has all of it.
Well, I got a set of it from Skip years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have all of June's, like it just would say like, you know, here it's like I also have some of her Fractured Flickers scripts and all of that stuff too. Because I guess when Heritage chose what they wanted, what they didn't want the Operation Loudmouth stuff because they didn't think it was worth anything. So June's niece gave it to me.
Right.
But so basically
it was all part of the whole Jay Ward saga, you know.
Yeah. And I love it that I love the artwork they did for Fractured Flickers where it just random, but there was some kind of filthy stuff in those in the early ones because it'd be like, well, who are the heroes of Fractured Flickers? And one of them would be like this little tiny photo on the bottom of Hitler, and then there's Kennedy and Reagan and I'm like, what?
Did you see, like, if you freeze frame it, at one point for like 2 frames, Jay Ward and Bill Scott are caricatured coming out of a revolving door in that opening. Yeah.
I'll look at that again.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
great. Well, lovely to finally catch up with you two as a team, and most enjoyable. And I'm sure we'll cross paths with this Zoom technology several times in the future.
Yes. All right. And thank you, Kamden, for being on the show. And that pretty much wraps up another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. We'll see you next time.